The letter came on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered with the kind of clinical precision that only government agencies manage. I was sitting in my kitchen in Boise, Idaho, staring at a bowl of cereal that had gone soggy while I tried to work up the energy to eat it, when the knock came at my door. The postal worker handed me the certified envelope with the sympathetic look that people reserve for delivering bad news, and I knew before I opened it what it would say. Veteran disability claim. Denied. 3 years of paperwork, medical evaluations, and testimonies all reduced to a single stamped word. The shrapnel in my left leg from that IED in Afghanistan apparently wasn't enough. The nightmares that woke me up screaming at 3 a.m. weren't service-connected. The tremor in my hands that made it impossible to hold a coffee cup steady was pre-existing. I crumpled the letter and threw it across the kitchen, where it bounced off the refrigerator and landed on the floor next to the food bowl that had been sitting empty for 3 days. That's when I remembered I had a dog. His name was Bear, a 3-year-old black Labrador mix that the VA had assigned to me 18 months earlier as part of their service dog program. He'd been trained to detect panic attacks, to provide deep pressure therapy during flashbacks, to wake me from nightmares before they became screams that disturbed the neighbors. He was supposed to be my lifeline back to normal life. Instead, he'd become a witness to my complete breakdown. I found him in the living room lying on his oversized bed near the window, watching me with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything I was trying to hide. He'd been trained to read human emotion, to respond to distress signals, but lately I'd been giving him so many distress signals that he'd started to look as tired as I felt. "Hey, Bear," I said, my voice hoarse from another night of smoking too many cigarettes and drinking too much bourbon. "Sorry about the food, I'll get it." He didn't move when I said his name, just kept watching me with that steady gaze that made me feel like he was taking my measure and finding me lacking, which was probably accurate. Bear had been perfect when they first assigned him to me. 85 pounds of calm, focused energy, trained by professionals who understood what veterans needed to rebuild their lives. He knew when to intervene during a panic attack, how to position himself to make me feel secure in crowded spaces, when to wake me from the nightmares that transported me back to patrol routes in Kandahar province. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being the veteran he was trained to help and started being just another disappointment in his life. The kitchen felt like it was closing in on me as I opened a can of dog food, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped the can opener twice before managing to get it open. Bear appeared beside me, not with the eager enthusiasm that most dogs show at mealtime, but with the patient resignation of an animal who'd learned not to expect much. "I'm sorry," I whispered as I set his bowl down. "I'm so sorry, buddy." He ate quietly while I leaned against the counter and tried to figure out what came next. The disability claim had been my last hope for some kind of financial stability. Without it, I couldn't afford to keep the apartment much longer. I'd already burned through my savings, maxed out my credit cards, and borrowed money from the few friends who still returned my calls. The worst part wasn't the money, though. The worst part was looking at Bear and knowing that he deserved better than what I was giving him. He deserved an owner who got up in the morning, who took him on walks, who engaged with the training he'd worked so hard to master. Instead, he'd gotten me, a broken-down veteran who spent most days trying to drink away memories that wouldn't stay buried. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister in Colorado. "Haven't heard from you in weeks, everything okay?" I started to type a response, then deleted it. What was I supposed to say? That I was so depressed I could barely get out of bed? That I'd been having panic attacks in grocery stores and had to leave my cart full of food in the middle of the produce section? That I was considering returning my service dog because I wasn't worthy of the help he'd been trained to provide? Instead, I turned off the phone and walked to the couch, where Bear was already waiting. He'd finished his food and positioned himself in what his trainers called alert mode, sitting tall, ears forward, eyes focused on me. He was reading my body language, my breathing pattern, the subtle signs that indicated I was spiraling toward another panic attack. "Stand down, Bear," I said, using the command that was supposed to release him from duty. "I'm fine." But he didn't stand down. He never did anymore because we both knew I was lying. Outside, Boise was transitioning into fall, the cottonwood trees along the Boise River turning gold and amber. I used to love this time of year, back when I could still enjoy simple things like changing seasons and cool morning air. Now it just reminded me that another year was ending, and I hadn't made any progress toward becoming the person I'd promised myself I'd be when I got home from deployment. Bear shifted closer to me on the couch, and I felt the weight of his body against my leg. It was one of his trained behaviors, deep pressure therapy, designed to ground veterans during episodes of dissociation or anxiety. The pressure was supposed to be comforting, reassuring, a physical reminder that I was safe and present. All I felt was guilt. "You know what, Bear?" I said, scratching behind his ears. "I think you'd be better off with someone else. Someone who actually deserves you." His tail thumped once against the couch cushion, a half-hearted response that felt like agreement. That night I called the VA and asked about the process for returning a service dog. The woman on the phone was professional but couldn't hide her surprise. "Mr. Rodriguez, our records show that Bear has been with you for 18 months. Has there been a problem with his training? An incident?" "No," I said. "He's perfect. That's the problem." There was a long pause. "I'm not sure I understand." "He deserves better than me," I said simply. "He deserves someone who can actually use his training, someone who's not a complete mess." "Mr. Rodriguez, have you been in contact with your VA counselor recently? Because what you're describing sounds like—" I hung up before she could finish the sentence. I knew what it sounded like. It sounded like depression, like PTSD, like all the things that Bear had been trained to help me manage. But knowledge and action were two different things, and I was stuck somewhere between knowing what I needed to do and being able to actually do it. Bear was sitting by the phone when I hung up, and I swear he understood every word of the conversation. His dark eyes held a sadness that mirrored my own, and for a moment I wondered if service dogs could get depressed from living with broken humans. That night we sat together on the couch in silence, both of us staring at the dark television screen. I was thinking about the forms I'd have to fill out to return him, about the interview process to make sure he'd be placed with someone more deserving. Bear was probably thinking about whatever dogs think about when their humans have given up on themselves. I didn't know it then, but that conversation with the VA had set something in motion, something that would test both of us in ways I couldn't imagine, and that would ultimately prove just how much love could accomplish when it refused to give up. What I also didn't know was that Bear had already made his own decision about our partnership, and unlike me, he wasn't planning to give up without a fight. The VA counselor's office smelled like disinfectant and artificial air freshener, a combination that always made my stomach turn. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a compact woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that probably came from years of dealing with veterans who were barely holding themselves together. Bear lay at my feet, his service vest making him officially invisible to everyone but me, though I could see Dr. Walsh stealing glances at him throughout our session. "Tell me about the decision to return Bear," she said, her pen poised over a legal pad that already had several pages of notes about my deteriorating mental state. "He's wasted on me," I said, staring at a diploma on her wall rather than meeting her eyes. "He's trained to help someone reintegrate into society, and I can barely integrate into my own apartment. Marcus, you've been living with severe depression and untreated PTSD for over a year. That doesn't make you unworthy of help. It makes you exactly the kind of person Bear was trained to assist." I felt Bear shift beside my chair, and when I looked down, he was watching me with that steady gaze that had become so familiar. His ears were forward, alert, reading my stress levels and preparing to intervene if necessary. "Look at him," I said to Dr. Walsh. "He's working right now. Every minute of every day he's trying to keep me functional, and for what? So I can sit in this apartment and feel sorry for myself? So I can drink bourbon for breakfast and forget to feed him? Have you been forgetting to feed him?" Her voice sharpened with concern. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not on purpose. I just forget things. Forget to eat. Forget to shower. Forget that there's another living creature depending on me." "Doctor." Walsh made a note, and I knew she was documenting everything I said for some kind of report that would follow me through the VA system forever. "Marcus, what you're describing is not unusual for someone dealing with your level of trauma. The forgetfulness, the self-isolation, the feeling that you don't deserve help, these are symptoms, not character flaws. Tell that to Bear when he's sitting by an empty food bowl." As if he understood the conversation, Bear stood up and moved to sit directly in front of my chair, positioning himself so I had to look at him. It was another trained behavior, interrupting negative thought patterns by demanding attention and eye contact. "He's doing his job right now," Dr. Walsh observed. "He's reading your distress and responding appropriately. That suggests your bond is stronger than you think." I looked into Bear's dark eyes and felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with panic attacks. My breathing started to quicken. My hands began to shake, and somewhere in the back of my mind I could hear the sound of an IED exploding on a dusty road outside Kandahar. Bear immediately moved closer, pressing his body weight against my legs and beginning the deep pressure therapy he'd been trained to provide. His presence was steady, warm, grounding me in the present moment and pulling me back from the edge of a full flashback. "That's remarkable," Dr. Walsh said softly. "He detected the onset of your panic attack before you were even fully aware of it yourself." The attack subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving me feeling drained and embarrassed. Bear maintained his position against my legs, monitoring my breathing and heart rate, ready to respond if the symptoms returned. "This happens every day," I said, "multiple times a day. He's constantly working, constantly watching me, constantly trying to keep me from falling apart. It's not fair to him." "Marcus, that's exactly what he was trained to do. That's his purpose, his job, the thing that gives his life meaning. By trying to take that away from him, you're not protecting him. You're abandoning him." Her words hit harder than I'd expected. I'd been so focused on my own unworthiness that I hadn't considered what the separation might do to Bear. Service dogs weren't just trained to help their handlers. They were bonded to them, emotionally invested in their well-being. "But what if I can't get better?" I asked. "What if this is as good as it gets? Is it fair to trap him with someone who's never going to be functional?" "That's not your decision to make alone," Dr. Walsh said. "It's also not a decision you should make while you're in the middle of a depressive episode. Have you been taking your medication?" I shook my head. The antidepressants made me feel disconnected, like I was watching my life through frosted glass. The sleep aids gave me nightmares that were somehow worse than the insomnia. "Have you been attending group therapy?" Another head shake. Sitting in a circle with other veterans, sharing our trauma and pretending that talking about it would somehow make it better. Felt like an exercise in futility. "Have you been using any of the coping strategies we discussed?" "I've been coping," I said defensively. "Drinking isn't coping, Marcus, it's avoidance." Bear's ears twitched at the change in my tone and he shifted position slightly, ready to intervene if our conversation triggered another anxiety response. Dr. Walsh set down her pen and leaned forward. "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you need to hear this. You're not failing Bear by needing his help. You're failing him by giving up on yourself. I'm not giving up. What would you call it?" I didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, I had an answer I didn't want to say out loud. "I want you to try something," Dr. Walsh continued. "Before you make any decisions about Bear, I want you to commit to 30 days of actually trying. Medication compliance, group therapy, individual sessions twice a week. Treat your recovery like a military mission, something you can't quit, something you have to see through to completion. And if it doesn't work, then we'll revisit the conversation about Bear's placement. But I think you might surprise yourself." The drive home was quiet, Bear sitting in the passenger seat with his head out the window, watching the familiar neighborhoods of Boise pass by. The afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes Idaho feel like the most beautiful place on earth. I'd grown up here, had planned to build a life here after my military service ended. Now it just felt like the place where I was slowly disappearing. When we got back to the apartment, I sat on the floor next to Bear's bed and really looked at him for the first time in weeks. He was beautiful. Thick black coat, intelligent eyes, the kind of dog that would have been adopted immediately if he'd ended up in a shelter. But he wasn't in a shelter. He was here, with me, because someone had believed that together we could be more than the sum of our broken parts. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked him. "Think it's worth giving this another shot?" Bear's tail wagged once, a careful, hopeful movement that seemed to say he'd been waiting for me to ask that question for months. That night, I took my medication for the first time in 3 weeks. The next morning, I called Dr. Walsh and signed up for group therapy. It wasn't much, but it was movement in the right direction. What I didn't know was that someone had been watching my apartment, learning my routines, waiting for the right moment to test just how much Bear and I were worth to each other. Group therapy was held in the basement of the Methodist Church on State Street, in a room that smelled like coffee and industrial carpet. 8 folding chairs arranged in a circle, 7 of them occupied by veterans in various stages of recovery, and one by Dr. Walsh, who facilitated our weekly descent into shared trauma. I'd been attending for 3 weeks and still felt like an imposter. The other veterans seemed further along in their healing. They had jobs, relationships, hobbies that didn't involve drinking alone in their apartments. When it was my turn to share, I usually deflected with humor or claimed I was doing better, which was technically true but still felt like lying. "Marcus," Dr. Walsh said during our 4th session, "you've been quiet tonight. How are things with Bear?" 7 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that preceded panic attacks. Bear, who was lying beside my chair, immediately lifted his head and moved closer to my legs. "Good," I said. "Better. We're figuring things out. Can you be more specific?" I looked around the circle at faces that reflected my own struggles. Jimmy, who'd lost his left arm to an IED near Fallujah. Sarah, whose convoy had been hit by a suicide bomber. Trevor, who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and came home to find his wife had left him for his brother. "I was going to return him," I said finally, "to the VA. I thought he deserved better than me." "What changed your mind?" This from Sarah, whose own service dog, a German shepherd named Echo, was lying alert beside her chair. "I realized I was being selfish," I said. "I was so focused on my own problems that I wasn't thinking about what the separation would do to him." "That's not selfish," Jimmy said. "That's depression lying to you, telling you that you're not worth saving." Bear pressed harder against my legs and I reached down to scratch behind his ears. His fur was soft and warm, and I could feel his steady breathing, the calm rhythm that had become my anchor during the worst moments. "The thing is," I continued, "I'm still not sure I'm worth saving, but I'm starting to think maybe it's not my decision to make alone." "Doctor?" Walsh smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. "That's significant progress, Marcus. Recovery isn't about feeling worthy of help. It's about accepting help, even when you don't feel worthy." The session ended at 9 p.m., and Bear and I walked to my truck through the crisp October evening. Downtown Boise was quiet on weeknights, just the occasional car passing under streetlights and the distant sound of music from bars I used to frequent before I stopped being able to handle crowds. We were 2 blocks from my apartment when Bear suddenly stopped walking. I looked down at him and his entire body was rigid, alert in a way I'd never seen before. His ears were forward, his tail low, and a quiet growl was building in his chest. This wasn't one of his trained behaviors. This was pure canine instinct sensing danger. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. He was staring at a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine running despite the late hour. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but something about the car's presence felt wrong. It was too clean, too deliberately positioned, like someone was trying to blend in but doing it badly. Bear's growl intensified, and he moved to position himself between me and the car. This was protective behavior I'd never seen from him before. He'd been trained to provide emotional support, not physical protection. "Easy, Bear," I said, though my own instincts were starting to scream warnings. 3 years of military training doesn't just disappear, and every combat veteran learns to trust their gut when something feels off. I started walking again, keeping my pace casual but watching the sedan in my peripheral vision. Bear walked beside me, still tense, still monitoring the car. When we turned the corner toward my apartment building, I heard the sedan's engine rev and saw headlights sweep across the intersection behind us. It was following us. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted house, accessible by an external staircase that left me exposed as I climbed to my door. I'd never thought about it as a tactical disadvantage before, but now it felt like walking into a funnel with no escape route. Bear was practically vibrating with tension as we reached the bottom of the stairs. I looked back and saw the sedan had parked about 50 yards away, positioned where the driver would have a clear view of my building. "Okay, buddy," I said quietly. "We're going to walk up these stairs normally, like nothing's wrong. Can you do that?" Bear looked up at me and I saw intelligence in his eyes that went beyond his service training. He understood that we were in danger, and he was ready to respond however I needed him to. We made it to my apartment door without incident, but as I fumbled with my keys, I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness below. Bear was pressed against my legs, still growling softly, his body coiled like a spring. Inside the apartment, I deadbolted the door and moved to the window that overlooked the street. The sedan was still there, engine running, waiting. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That a car was parked on a public street? That my dog seemed nervous? The officer who took my call was polite but clearly thought I was paranoid. "Sir, unless someone has threatened you or committed a crime, there's not much we can do about a vehicle being parked legally on city property." "It's been following me," I said. "Do you have any idea who it might be? Ex-girlfriend, former coworker, someone you might have had a disagreement with?" I thought about it. My ex-wife lived in California and hadn't spoken to me since the divorce. I didn't have any coworkers to disagree with since I'd been unemployed for 8 months. My social circle had shrunk to basically nobody. "No," I admitted. "I can't think of anyone who would want to follow me." Well, if you see them again or if they approach you directly, give us a call. Otherwise, try not to worry about it. Could be someone lost, someone waiting for a friend, any number of innocent explanations. But Bear wasn't acting like the explanation was innocent. He spent the entire night by the window, alert and watchful, occasionally letting out low warning growls when shadows moved in the street below. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning the sedan was gone, but Bear's behavior hadn't returned to normal. He was hypervigilant during our walk, constantly checking our surroundings, positioning himself protectively whenever we encountered other people. At the VA hospital for my appointment with Dr. Walsh, he refused to settle in his usual spot by my chair, instead pacing the small office and periodically checking the window. He's different today, Dr. Walsh observed. More agitated. Someone was watching my apartment last night, I said, following us home from group therapy. Did you call the police? They said there was nothing they could do unless an actual crime was committed. Doctor, Walsh frowned. Do you have any idea who it might be? None. That's what's so unsettling about it. Marcus, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you been experiencing any paranoid thoughts lately? Any feelings that people are watching you or following you when they're not? I knew what she was getting at. Paranoia was a common symptom of PTSD, especially when combined with depression and anxiety. But I also knew the difference between paranoid delusions and actual danger. Bear saw it too, I said. He was growling, positioning himself protectively. That's not normal behavior for him. Doctor? Walsh looked at Bear, who had finally settled but was still alert, still scanning the room for potential threats. You're right, she said. That's not typical service dog behavior. They're trained to remain calm in most situations. So what do I do? Be careful. Vary your routines. Maybe stay somewhere else for a few nights if you have that option. But I didn't have that option. I didn't have friends to stay with, family in town, or money for a hotel. My apartment was all I had. And if someone wanted to watch it, there wasn't much I could do to stop them. That night, the sedan was back. This time, I was ready for it. I'd positioned a chair by the window and kept watch from behind curtains that were closed enough to hide me, but open enough to see the street. Bear lay beside me, alert and tense, both of us waiting for something we couldn't name. At 2:47 a.m., someone got out of the car. The figure that emerged from the sedan was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing that helped him blend into the shadows between streetlights. He moved with purpose, not like someone who was lost or confused, but like someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he planned to do when he got there. Bear saw him before I did, his body going rigid beside my chair. A low growl started deep in his chest, so quiet I almost couldn't hear it, but I felt the vibration where his side pressed against my leg. I see him too, buddy, I whispered, reaching down to rest my hand on Bear's back. His muscles were coiled tight, every instinct telling him that danger was approaching. The man stopped at the base of my stairs and looked up toward my window. I pulled back from the curtain, but not before getting a good look at his face. He was maybe 40 years old with sharp features and the kind of stillness that comes from military training. This wasn't some random criminal looking for an easy target. This was someone with specific purpose and professional skill. My phone was charging on the nightstand, but by the time I could reach it and call 911, he'd either be gone or already inside my apartment. The external staircase that had always felt like a minor inconvenience suddenly felt like a highway leading directly to my door. Bear moved to the window, pressing his nose against the glass and letting out a soft whine that somehow managed to sound both worried and protective. When I looked down at the street, the man was gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting by my front door with a baseball bat across my knees, listening for footsteps on the stairs. Bear positioned himself between me and the door, alert and ready. Neither of us slept. The next morning I called Dr. Walsh and told her about the incident. Marcus, I think you should file a police report even if they can't do anything immediately. You need documentation in case this escalates. Escalates to what? I don't know. But someone who's willing to get out of their car and approach your building at 3 a.m. isn't just casually interested in your activities. I took Bear with me to the police station, partly for emotional support and partly because I felt safer with him beside me. The officer who took my report was thorough but clearly skeptical. So this person didn't approach your door? Didn't try to break in? Didn't threaten you in any way? No, but... And you have no idea who they might be, or why they would be interested in you specifically? No. Mr. Rodriguez, I understand that this is concerning, but without evidence of an actual crime, There's very little we can do. We can increase patrols in your neighborhood, and I'll make sure the night shift is aware of the situation. It was better than nothing, but not by much. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought new deadbolts, a motion-activated light for the stairs, and a small security camera that I could position to watch the street. If someone was going to keep watching my apartment, at least I'd have video evidence of who they were. Installing the camera meant climbing onto my roof, which required leaving Bear alone in the apartment for the first time in weeks. I could hear him whining through the door as I worked, and when I came back inside, he was pacing anxiously from room to room. "Sorry, buddy," I said, kneeling down to let him sniff my hands and reassure himself that I was okay. I just needed to set up some security. That night, we established a new routine. I moved my mattress into the living room where I could watch both the front door and the window. Bear positioned himself where he could see the door, and we took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, one of us always alert and watching. It sounds paranoid, but it worked. When the sedan returned at 1:23 a.m., I was awake and watching. When the man got out of the car at 2:15 a.m., my camera captured his face clearly enough to make out details I'd missed before. A scar along his jawline, military-style tattoos on his forearms, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to danger. This time, he didn't just look at my building. He walked completely around it, testing windows, checking doors, mapping out the layout like someone planning an assault. Bear was shaking with the effort of staying quiet. Every instinct he had was telling him to bark, to sound an alarm, to drive away the threat. But he'd been trained to follow my lead, and I was staying silent because I wanted to see what this man was really planning. The stranger spent 20 minutes circling my building before returning to his car. As he drove away, I got a partial license plate number, something ending in 7G2. The next morning, I gave the police the video footage and the partial plate. The officer who reviewed it was more interested than his colleague had been the day before. "This is definitely concerning behavior," he admitted. "Someone conducting surveillance on your residence, checking entry points, that suggests intent to commit a crime. So what happens now? We'll run the partial plate, see if we can identify the vehicle. In the meantime, I'd recommend staying somewhere else if you have that option." But I still didn't have anywhere else to go, and even if I did, I wasn't sure running away was the right answer. This person had found me once. They could find me again. At least in my apartment, I knew the terrain. Dr. Walsh disagreed. During our session that afternoon, she was more forceful than I'd ever seen her. "Marcus, this has moved beyond normal paranoia or PTSD symptoms. Someone is actively stalking you, and you need to take it seriously." "I am taking it seriously. I've got cameras, new locks, the police have the footage. That's not enough. You need to get somewhere safe while they figure out who this person is and what they want. And where would you suggest I go? I don't have family here. I don't have friends I can impose on, and I can't afford a hotel indefinitely. There are resources, veterans shelters, transitional housing." "No." The word came out harder than I'd intended. "I'm not abandoning my home because some stranger is playing games. This isn't about your pride, Marcus. It's about your safety. It's about not running away from another fight." Bear, who had been lying quietly beside my chair, suddenly lifted his head and moved to the window. His body went rigid, and that familiar growl started building in his chest. Dr. Walsh and I both turned to look, and there in the parking lot was the dark sedan. "He followed us here," I said, more amazed than afraid. "He knows our routines." Dr. Walsh was already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling 911. "Wait." I stood up and moved to the window, and the man in the car saw me looking. Instead of driving away, he rolled down his window and stared directly at me, making no effort to hide his presence. That's when I realized this had never been about stealth or surveillance. This was psychological warfare, designed to make me feel hunted, vulnerable, constantly on edge. Someone wanted me to know I was being watched, wanted me to feel trapped and helpless. The question was why, and the answer, when it finally came, would turn out to be something I never could have imagined. Bear pressed against my legs, and I looked down into his dark eyes. Whatever was coming, we'd face it together. He'd been trained to help me manage my demons, but now it looked like we were going to have to deal with someone else's demons too. The man in the car sat there for another 10 minutes, then drove away slowly, making sure I saw him leave. "That was a message," I told Dr. Walsh. "What kind of message?" "I think we're about to find out." The answer came 3 days later, delivered not by a knock on my door or a phone call, but by a woman I hadn't seen in 4 years standing in the produce aisle of the Albertsons on Fairview Avenue. I was buying groceries for the first time in weeks, trying to return to some semblance of normal life despite the sedan that had been following me intermittently for over a week. Bear saw her before I did, his ears pricking forward with recognition rather than alarm. When I turned to see what had caught his attention, my stomach dropped like I'd stepped off a cliff. "Hello, Marcus." Elena Vasquez looked exactly as I remembered her from our deployment in Afghanistan, small and fierce with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been our unit's intelligence specialist, the person who briefed us on threats and analyzed patterns that kept us alive in hostile territory. "Elena," my voice came out as barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "Shopping for groceries, same as you." She glanced down at Bear, who was wagging his tail cautiously, and keeping an eye on an old friend who's been getting some unwanted attention. The pieces clicked together in my head with sickening clarity. "You've been watching me. Not me personally, but yes, we've been monitoring the situation." "We?" She gestured toward the store's exit. "Why don't we continue this conversation somewhere more private? There's a lot you need to know, and very little time to explain it." I followed her out of the store in a daze, Bear walking between us like he was trying to process the familiarity of her scent against the strangeness of the situation. In the parking lot, Elena led me to a white SUV where a man I didn't recognize sat behind the wheel. "Marcus Rodriguez, meet Agent David Chen, FBI," Elena said. "David, this is the soldier I told you about." Agent Chen was Asian American, maybe 35 years old, with the kind of calm professionalism that suggested he dealt with unusual situations on a regular basis. He shook my hand through the driver's window and studied Bear with obvious appreciation. "Beautiful dog," he said. "Service animal?" "Yes." "Elena, what the hell is going on?" She leaned against the SUV and looked around the parking lot before answering. "How much do you remember about our last mission in Afghanistan? The convoy that got hit outside Kandahar?" "Everything." I remembered every detail of that day. The heat, the dust, the sound of the IED explosion that had filled my leg with shrapnel and killed 2 of my brothers in arms. I remembered Elena bleeding from a head wound, me carrying her to the medevac helicopter while insurgents took pot shots at us from abandoned buildings. "I remember," I said. "Do you remember the intelligence we recovered from that compound? The hard drives and documents that I carried out while you were keeping me conscious?" "Vaguely. I was more focused on not bleeding to death." That intelligence led to the capture of a high-value target named Malik Hassan, arms dealer, drug trafficker, someone who'd been funding insurgent operations throughout the region. "We got him, Marcus. Because of what we found that day. Because of what you helped me carry out of that compound." Agent Chen spoke up from the driver's seat. "Hassan was sentenced to life in federal prison, but he had associates who blamed the intelligence unit that brought him down. Specifically, they blamed the 2 soldiers who recovered the evidence." I felt cold despite the warm October afternoon. "Elena, are you telling me someone's trying to kill us because of something that happened 4 years ago?" 3 of Hassan's associates have been killed in the past 6 months, she said. "All of them made to look like accidents or random crimes. But we identified a pattern, and we realized that our unit members might be targets. Why didn't you contact me sooner?" "We tried. Your VA counselor said you weren't responding to outreach attempts, and your emergency contacts were outdated. By the time we located you, someone else had already found you too. The man in the sedan. The one who'd been watching my apartment, following me, learning my routines." "Who is he?" Agent Chen pulled out a tablet and showed me a photo of the man I'd seen on my security camera. Yusuf al-Rashid, former Syrian Special Forces now working as a freelance assassin. He specializes in making kills look like suicides or accidents. My legs felt unsteady, and I leaned against Elena's SUV for support. Bear immediately moved to press against my leg, providing the deep pressure therapy he'd been trained to give during panic attacks. "How long have you known he was here?" "We've been tracking him for 2 weeks, Elena said. "He's been very careful, very patient. Our assessment is that he's been studying your routine, your mental state, looking for the right opportunity to make your death look like a veteran's suicide." The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been watching me, learning about my depression, my struggles, my isolation, planning to use my own mental health against me. "What do you want me to do?" "Come with us," Agent Chen said. "We have a safe house where you can stay while we coordinate Hassan's remaining associates. It should only take a few weeks to wrap this up." I looked down at Bear, who was monitoring my stress levels and preparing to intervene if my anxiety spiked too high. The idea of leaving Boise, of abandoning the small progress I'd made in therapy, felt like running away from another fight. What about my dog? What about my treatment at the VA? We can arrange for both, Elena said. Marcus, this isn't optional. Al-Rashid has killed 3 people already, and he's not going to stop until you're dead. But why now? Why wait 4 years to come after us? Agent Chen answered. Hassan died in prison last month. Heart attack, but his associates think he was murdered. They're cleaning house, eliminating anyone who played a role in his capture. The parking lot suddenly felt exposed. Dangerous. I found myself scanning the area for threats, for dark sedans, for anyone who might be watching us. Bear sensed my increasing anxiety and moved closer, his body warm and solid against my leg. How do I know you're telling the truth? I asked. How do I know this isn't some elaborate scam? Elena pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos. Crime scenes, police reports, obituaries for 3 men I recognized from our unit. All of them had died in the past 6 months. All of them in ways that could have been accidents. This is real, Marcus, and it's happening whether you cooperate with us or not. I stood in that parking lot, looking at the evidence that someone wanted me dead, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. For weeks I'd been doubting my own perceptions, wondering if my paranoia was just another symptom of PTSD. Now I knew that my instincts had been right all along. If I go with you, I said, what happens to my life here? My apartment? My therapy? My routine? You can come back when this is over, Elena said. But Marcus, if you don't come with us, you might not have a life to come back to. Bear looked up at me with those intelligent dark eyes, and I realized he was waiting for my decision. Whatever I chose, he'd follow. But for the first time since I'd gotten him, I felt like I was the one protecting him instead of the other way around. Okay, I said. Let's go. What I didn't know was that Al-Rashid had been watching from across the parking lot, taking photos of our conversation, already adapting his plan to account for federal protection. And what none of us knew was that Bear would soon prove that his training as a service dog was nothing, compared to his instincts as a guardian. The safe house was a 2-story cabin on 20 acres of pine forest, about an hour north of Boise, the kind of place where you could go weeks without seeing another human being if you wanted to. Agent Chen had driven us there in his SUV while Elena followed in a separate vehicle, both of them constantly checking mirrors and taking random turns to make sure we weren't being followed. Bear spent the entire drive with his head out the window, alert but not anxious, like he understood we were moving away from danger rather than toward it. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and the promise of early snow. This is beautiful, I said as we pulled up to the cabin. It was rustic but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and large windows that would give us excellent visibility in all directions. It should be safe, Elena said, getting out of her car. No road access except the way we came, no neighbors for miles, and we've got motion sensors and cameras covering the perimeter. Agent Chen showed me around the interior. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen stocked with enough food for several weeks, and a communications room with equipment that looked like something from a spy movie. You'll stay here with Agent Morrison, he said, gesturing to a woman I hadn't noticed before who emerged from what I'd thought was a closet. She's been setting up surveillance equipment. Agent Morrison was maybe 30 years old, with short blonde hair and the kind of compact build that suggested serious martial arts training. She shook my hand with a grip that could have crushed walnuts. Nice to meet you, Marcus, and this must be Bear. Bear allowed her to pet him but kept his attention focused on Elena, who was clearly the person he trusted most in this new environment. How long do we stay here? I asked. Hopefully just a few weeks, Elena said. We've got teams tracking Hassan's remaining associates, and once we roll them up, the threat to you should be eliminated. That first night I sat on the cabin's front porch with Bear at my feet, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to process how dramatically my life had changed in a single day. 24 hours ago, my biggest worry had been whether I was worthy of keeping my service dog. Now I was in federal protection because someone was planning to murder me. Bear seemed to sense my emotional turmoil. He moved closer to my chair and rested his head on my knee, providing the deep pressure therapy that had become second nature to him. His dark eyes were calm, patient, like he was telling me that whatever came next, we'd handle it together. You know what, buddy? I said, scratching behind his ears. Maybe this is exactly what we needed. A chance to start over somewhere new. Elena came out onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. How are you holding up? Better than I expected, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. It's strange, but I feel more like myself out here than I have in months. That's not uncommon. Sometimes a change of environment can break the cycle of depression and anxiety. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Vasquez? She laughed, and for a moment it was like we were back in Afghanistan, taking a break between missions to remember what it felt like to be normal people. Actually, it is. I went back to school after my discharge, got a master's in psychology. I work for the FBI now, specializing in cases involving veterans. So this isn't just about protecting me from Hassan's associates. This is also about trying to fix me. Marcus, you're not broken. You're dealing with trauma in a way that millions of veterans understand. But yes, part of my job is making sure you get the support you need. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pine trees and the distant sound of an owl calling to its mate. Bear had relaxed completely, no longer scanning for threats, just enjoying the peace of the mountain evening. Elena, I said eventually, why didn't you stay in touch after we got back? I tried to call you a few times, but your number was disconnected. She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Because I blamed myself for what happened to you, she said finally. You got hurt carrying me out of that compound. You've been struggling with PTSD for 4 years, and it's because you risked your life to save mine. That's not... Let me finish. I've been tracking your progress through VA records, watching from a distance as you struggled with depression, unemployment, relationship problems. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone you're sorry their life got derailed because they were brave enough to help you? I looked at her in the dim porch light and saw something I'd never noticed during our deployment, guilt that matched my own. Elena, what happened to me isn't your fault. I made choices after I got back, bad choices that had nothing to do with that day in Afghanistan. Did you? Or did you make the only choices available to someone dealing with untreated trauma? It was a question I'd never considered, and I didn't have an answer for it. The next few days fell into a routine that was surprisingly comfortable. Agent Morrison monitored communications and perimeter security, while Elena and I spent hours talking about our deployment, our struggles with readjustment, and the ways trauma had shaped our post-military lives. Bear seemed to thrive in the mountain environment, playing in the snow that had started falling and sleeping more peacefully than he had in months. He's different here, Elena observed one afternoon, as we watched Bear chase a tennis ball through the trees. More relaxed. So am I admitted. I keep expecting the anxiety to come back, the panic attacks, the depression, but I feel clear, like I can think straight for the first time in years. That's because you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. On the 4th day, Agent Chen arrived with news that changed everything. We got him, he said, as soon as he walked through the door. Al-Rashid. He was spotted at a hotel in Boise and we took him down without incident. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. So it's over? Almost. We still need to locate Hassan's other associates, but with Al-Rashid in custody, the immediate threat to you is eliminated. How long before I can go home? Agent Chen and Elena exchanged a look that made my stomach tighten. Marcus, Elena said carefully, we need to talk about what home looks like now. Al-Rashid had detailed surveillance photos of your apartment, your routines, even your therapy sessions. He knew everything about your life in Boise. So going back to the exact same routine makes you vulnerable if there are other threats we haven't identified yet. Agent Morrison spoke up from her monitoring station. We'd recommend relocating, at least temporarily. Different city, different identity if necessary. The idea of starting over somewhere new should have been terrifying. But as I looked around the cabin that had become a sanctuary, I realized it might be exactly what I needed. What about Bear? What about his training, his certification? All of that transfers, Elena said. In fact, we might be able to place you in a VA program somewhere else, somewhere with better resources and support systems. That night, I lay in the cabin's guest bedroom, with Bear curled up beside me. And for the first time in months I felt hopeful about the future. Not because my problems had been solved, but because I finally understood that I didn't have to solve them alone. What I didn't know was that Al-Rashid had escaped federal custody during transport to a secure facility, and that he was already on his way to the mountains to finish what he'd started. The peace we'd found in the wilderness was about to be shattered, and Bear would soon prove that his loyalty was stronger than any training, deeper than any program, and worth more than life itself. I woke up to Bear's low growling at 3:17 a.m., the kind of deep, quiet warning that meant immediate danger. He was standing at the bedroom window, every muscle in his body tense, his attention focused on something moving in the darkness outside. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, rolling out of bed and moving to join him at the window. The motion sensor lights around the cabin's perimeter were dark, which meant either they'd malfunctioned or someone had disabled them. In the pale moonlight filtering through the pine trees, I could see shapes moving between the shadows, at least 2 figures approaching the cabin from different directions. My military training kicked in immediately. I grabbed my phone to call Agent Morrison, but there was no signal. The communications had been jammed. Bear followed me to the bedroom door, moving silently despite his size. We crept down the hallway toward the main room where Morrison had set up her monitoring station, but when we got there, the equipment was dark, and she was nowhere to be seen. "Agent Morrison?" I called softly. No response. The front door was slightly ajar, cold mountain air flowing through the gap. Either Morrison had gone outside to investigate, or someone had already been inside the cabin. Bear's hackles were raised, and he was alternating between protective postures and the alert stance he'd been trained to use during my panic attacks. He understood that I was in danger, but he was also monitoring my stress levels, trying to provide emotional support while staying ready for physical threats. I moved to the communications room and tried the radio, but got only static. The landline was dead. Whatever was happening, we were completely cut off from backup. That's when I heard Elena's voice outside, sharp with pain and fear. "Marcus, don't come out. It's a trap." Through the front window, I could see her kneeling in the clearing in front of the cabin, her hands zip-tied behind her back. Standing behind her was the man from my security footage, Yusuf al-Rashid, holding a pistol to the base of her skull. "Mr. Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the mountain air. "I know you can hear me. You have 30 seconds to come outside or your friend dies." Bear was shaking with the effort of staying quiet. Every instinct he had was telling him to bark, to attack, to defend his pack, but he'd been trained to follow my lead, and I was trying to think strategically rather than emotionally. 20 seconds, Mr. Rodriguez." I could see Elena's face in the moonlight. She was bleeding from a head wound, but her eyes were alert, focused. She mouthed a single word: "Run." But there was nowhere to run. Al-Rashid had positioned himself where he could see all the exits from the cabin, and the forest around us was dense enough that I'd never make it to the road without being caught. 10 seconds. I looked down at Bear, who was watching me with complete trust, waiting for my decision. He'd spent 18 months learning to read my emotions, to anticipate my needs, to provide exactly the support I required in any situation. Now I was asking him to trust me in a situation that could get us both killed. "Stay," I whispered to him, using the command that would keep him in place no matter what happened. Then I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. "There we are," Al-Rashid said, his accent thick but his English precise. "The hero who cost me everything." "Let her go," I said. "Your problem is with me, not with Elena. My problem is with both of you. But you're right. Ladies first." He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the mountains like thunder, and Elena collapsed forward into the snow. I started to run toward her, but Al-Rashid swung his weapon toward me. "That was for Hassan," he said. "This is for me." That's when Bear decided he'd heard enough. He came through the front door like a guided missile, 85 pounds of muscle and fury moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. He'd been trained to provide emotional support, to detect panic attacks, to wake me from nightmares. But underneath all that training, he was still a dog, and dogs protect their pack. Al-Rashid turned at the sound of Bear's approach, but he was too slow. Bear hit him in the chest with enough force to knock him backward, sending the pistol flying into the snow. They went down together. Bear's jaws locked around Al-Rashid's arm, the assassin screaming and trying to reach a knife from his belt. "Bear, release!" I shouted, but he ignored the command. For the first time since I'd known him, he was acting on pure instinct rather than training. I ran toward them, but Al-Rashid managed to pull his knife and slash at Bear's side. Bear yelped but didn't let go, and I saw blood starting to stain his black fur. I tackled Al-Rashid from the side, pinning his knife hand to the ground. We fought in the snow while Bear maintained his grip on the assassin's other arm, the three of us locked in a struggle that felt like it lasted hours but probably took less than a minute. Finally, I managed to get control of the knife and pin Al-Rashid face down in the snow. He stopped fighting, breathing hard, defeated. "Bear, release," I said again, and this time he obeyed, backing away but staying alert, ready to attack again if necessary. That's when I saw how badly he was hurt. The knife had opened a deep gash along his ribs, and blood was flowing freely onto the snow. He was still standing, still watching Al-Rashid for signs of movement, but I could see his strength fading. "Elena," I called. "Are you okay?" She raised her head from where she'd fallen. Alive. The bullet hit my shoulder. "But Marcus, you need to put pressure on Bear's wound." I used Al-Rashid's shirt to bandage Bear's side, but I could feel how much blood he was losing. His breathing was becoming labored and his legs were starting to shake. "Stay with me, buddy," I whispered. "You did good. You saved us." Bear looked up at me with those intelligent dark eyes, and his tail gave one weak wag. He was trying to comfort me even while he was dying. That's when Agent Morrison appeared at the edge of the clearing, leading a team of federal agents. Al-Rashid had taken her by surprise earlier, but she'd managed to escape and call for backup. "We need a medevac," I told her. "Now. Elena's been shot, and my dog is bleeding out." The helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, but it felt like hours. I held Bear in my arms while the paramedics worked on Elena, feeling his heart beating against my chest, trying to keep him conscious with the sound of my voice. "Remember when I found you?" I said. "Remember how you taught me that I was worth saving? Now I need you to let me save you." But Bear was fading. The veterinarian who met us at the hospital did everything he could, but the knife had damaged too many vital organs. Bear had given everything he had to protect his pack, and there wasn't enough left to save. He died in my arms at sunrise, looking into my eyes with the same trust and love he'd shown me every day for 18 months. The funeral was small. Elena, Agent Morrison, Agent Chen, Dr. Walsh, and a few other veterans from my therapy group. We buried Bear on a hillside overlooking the Boise River, with military honors befitting a hero who'd given his life in service to others. Elena, recovering from her shoulder wound, spoke at the service. "Bear was trained to save one veteran," she said. "But by saving Marcus, he saved all of us. He reminded us what loyalty looks like, what love looks like, what courage looks like when it doesn't think about the cost." I couldn't speak at his funeral. I was too broken, too grateful, too aware that I was alive because a dog had loved me more than he loved his own life. But later, when I was alone at his grave, I finally found the words. "You were right about me, buddy," I said. "I was worth saving. And you proved it by being willing to die to keep me here. I'll never forget that. I'll never waste what you gave me." I kept that promise. I moved to Colorado, closer to Elena and my sister, and enrolled in a new VA program. I got a job working with other veterans, helping them understand that their lives have value even when they can't see it themselves. I adopted another dog, a golden retriever named Hope, but I never forgot the German Shepherd who taught me that love doesn't count the cost. Bear died protecting me, and I never deserved him. But that's the thing about unconditional love. It doesn't require deserving. It just requires accepting, and learning, and becoming the person that love believes you can be. He saved my life in every way that matters, and in return I promise to live a life worthy of his sacrifice. It's a promise I keep every single day.